Welcome everyone to the quarterly meeting of the Women's General Counsel Forum co-hosted by NACD and Baker Botts. My name is Catherine Zinn. I'm the Chief Client Officer at Baker Botts, and the firm is so honored to be the founding supporting sponsor of this cohort and of these programs. Our hour-long discussion today will focus on how the General Counsel can stay ahead in a world of rapid regulatory change, with an emphasis on how the General Counsel liaises with their board on a wide range of related issues. Our very experienced panelists will introduce themselves momentarily, but first, a word about you, our audience. You are all General Counsels. Many of you are also sitting public and private company directors. Thank you for your service. And a special welcome to our NACD members, and a big thank you to the men who have joined us today. This is a first for this cohort, and we welcome you. And I am particularly grateful for this as it relates to this cohort, for the men joining. And some of you on the panel who have been longtime friends and in the audience that I see are going to say, Catherine, the unapologetic feminist, is thanking the men. And I'd allow me to explain. Many of you who do know me know that I have a passion and something of a proven track record of success for helping place women general counsels on their first board. And I want you to know that my ability to help more women is only been possible because of so many men who are executives, sitting directors, being so intentional about looking at the composition of their companies and the boards that they serve on, and looking to women and women with your background in particular, who they know are ready to serve. So if I may, back to the program. We hope you will, the audience, engage in the dialogue by making comments, questions in the chat, and we will do our best to monitor the chat real time. Please be patient with me. And with that, I am now going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And Kim Rivera, may I start with you?
Yes, you may. Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Very excited to be here. I'm Kim Rivera. I'm currently the Chief Legal Officer at OneTrust. I'm actually a 3-time CLO of both public and private companies, and a 2-time board member of public companies as well. And I am really looking forward to the program today.
We're so glad you're here. Michelle Lee.
Hi, folks. Really great to meet all of you. I am currently on sabbatical, but most recently, I was the general counsel of Pinterest. And prior to that, I led global litigation and regulatory disputes for Twitter and was a Department of Justice attorney. I'm really thrilled to chat with all of you here today.
Thank you, Michelle. Mary.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. My name's Mary Dent. My background is in first telecom and then banking. I've been general counsel of public and private companies here and in Europe. I have been on 6 boards. I've served on, I think, every committee. The first was a public board. Since then, actually, it's 7 boards, 1 public, 6 private. Since then, I've gravitated to private boards. I really like the ability to take what's required for public boards and decide what of it to implement in private boards. And I am now, currently, I actually kind of took a step back and am general counsel of a small financial services advisory firm. And it's really nice to do a GC job that's kind of easy, and then spend the rest of my time advising clients on how to build banks and run banks and do fintech startups and all that.
Oh, great. Thank you to all of you, and what extensive and wonderful experiences represented here. For my part, as your moderator, I bring my experience in my day job to bear on the subject matter today. I help run a large law firm. Just for the record, I am not a lawyer. I have a business role with the firm. And if I may, for those of you who are not familiar with Baker Botts, we're a global law firm in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and of course here in the US, we focus on two sectors, primarily energy and technology. Our revenue from those sectors is pretty much split equally between the two. In addition to my day job, I do also serve as a director on two private company boards and on a host of nonprofit boards. I am grateful to Lisa and to Kate for the opportunity to serve on NACD's Leadership Council. So without further ado, what an interesting and rigorous time it is to be a board member, to be a general counsel, and my goodness, there has been a lot of change since this cohort last met. My first question is to all of the panelists. What have you found yourselves focused on, and how are your boards looking at the new landscape in the last 3 months? And perhaps you can share, for the benefit of our audience, some of the actionable steps you think general counsels can take to embed a culture of compliance throughout their organizations. And Mary, I'm laughing now since you said your job is easy. Do you want to start?
Sure. So the legal part of it's easy. We're not particularly in my core work, and even on my boards, we're not particularly exposed to supply chain issues. So I can kind of take a pass on the tariff stuff. But I think the hardest thing is finding the time to really think about AI in a deep way. And while managing just the day-to-day stuff, there is so much that happens that's urgent, particularly now as everything seems to change on a daily basis. And yet there are really basic questions about what the world is like, and what the world is going to be like even in a few years. And it's hard to carve out the time for both thinking about it individually and then collaboratively thinking about it. And I'd say everything.
Carve out the time. Kim, what would you like to add?
So, I would add a couple of things. First, just in terms of your first question, what keeps me up at night, or what am I thinking about? Taking it in sort of the context of actionable. The amount, the company that I am currently working at is in the responsible data and AI space. That is what we do. So the amount of regulatory uncertainty, change, and diversity of regulations being adopted both in Europe and across the states here, are a big challenge, and trying to think about how to stay ahead of where those regulations are going, really building relationships with the leading regulators, and trying to keep a finger on the pulse of what the trends are and where they're headed. I think is a big challenge, and something that we are spending a lot of time both cultivating relationships, making sure that we're creating a network where we're gathering intelligence and information from across our entire network of customers, contributors, our legal network, and trying to turn those into actionable insights for ourselves and our customers. The other thing I will say is, I just had this discussion with my entire team earlier today, which, by the way, spans not just the legal group, it's the cybersecurity group, the people group, a bunch of other corporate functions. We are in a time where we cannot be ready for everything. There's no way for us to be prepared for everything, but we do need to figure out a way to be prepared for anything, right? And that means having teams that are aligned with each other, know how to respond quickly to developments, and have their finger on the pulse of what are the most material things to our company and to our customers, and how do we keep our eye on those and make sure that we're ready to respond quickly regardless of the development. That's a pretty big challenge, but making sure that you're looking at that every day and trying to think about response time, resiliency, ability to activate fast action plans, regardless of topic, having the board and the executive team and other teams aligned. Those are all things I think to be investing in right now.
Kim, I'm glad you set the table in that way, because we are going to come back to what you just talked about. You can't anticipate everything, but you need to be ready for anything. We're going to come back and talk about that with a little bit more specificity about what the panelists' recommendations are in that regard. Michelle, what would you add?
So I've spent a lot of time in the consumer technology space, and obviously in that space, the headwinds and the tailwinds seem to change every single day, right? You know, the US will lean in on some particular issue, Europe might lean out, but these days it tends to be Europe is, you know, very much focused on digital regulation, and the United States is saying, let's hands off, let's step back from enforcement, let's step back from regulation. And so your question of how do we maintain a culture of compliance is an incredible question, right? It's one we often focus on, but in these times, what does it mean to even be compliant, right? Because, you know, Foreign Practices Act is something that's, you know, fairly sacred for most lawyers as we think about, you know, what are the tenets of how people behave when doing business. And now we know that that may be something that is, you know, suspended enforcement now, could be rolled back later. And so when we think about a culture of compliance and sort of, you know, tone from the top, I think we have to focus not only on what we've learned in the past about compliance, but also adapting to changing times and understanding, you know, what our risk tolerance is as a company as we continue to move forward. Are we continuing to say the same thresholds of what is appropriate levels of risk? Or are we going to reevaluate that both on the management side as well as potentially on the board side? You know, we do feel like now these times are incredibly unpredictable. But, you know, there's a lot of documentation that exists out there about where this administration is going, where regulation in Europe is going. And as attorneys and folks on the team, you know, we really have to spend a lot of time, as Kim mentioned, focusing on how do we corral our team's internal knowledge management to just keep up. And as Mary mentioned, AI is an incredibly solid resource for being able to keep up with all of the news on a daily basis and all of the evolving laws to make sure that we really stay ahead for the benefit of the business.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's stay with you for a moment as you navigate all of this, and you talked about the role of the legal department. Let's go further. What is the role of the general counsel in that creating, especially now, effective communication between the board and management? And what do you see the role of the general counsel as, and how's that evolving? And if you could give some specific examples on how you think the general counsel can help that be both focused and productive.
Sure. I often view the general counsel as sort of the bridge of communication. You know, people often say it's really clear what management does. Management, we manage. We do the execution. We do the day-to-day work. The board, they're engaged in oversight, which is a completely different responsibility. And people hold these ideas top of mind. But in reality, the way that management and the board often operate sort of there isn't a clear understanding of what each side means. And often general counsel is involved in sort of serving as the interpreter of folks' different expectations. So one of the things that I think is helpful that I've done in the past is really understanding, you know, what we're doing in terms of horizon scanning. So on the management side, we spend a lot of time thinking through what are potential risks, what are potential issues before they blow up into multi-million-dollar liability or issues. And to communicate that sort of horizon scanning with the board, with the audit committee, to really help them understand what issues are coming down the pipe. It's not urgent right now, but we need to help you put into perspective in dollars and cents what these big pictures may be as it blows up down the line. And so that's, you know, I think part of that clear communication between the board and the management, really making sure there aren't any surprises. You know, one of the things that I've found in the consumer technology space is stuff ends up in the headlines before it even gets communicated to directors, not at companies that I've worked with, but for other folks. And so I think the general counsel really needs to be there to make sure that folks are, you know, communicating all moving developments very quickly with the board as soon as it comes up. Obviously, we're also going to want to serve as the hub. Sorry, are you hearing a little bit of feedback? Is that? Oh, hold on. Let me.
I went on mute. It might be me.
Oh, okay. And then just the last one was making sure that as serving as that hub of communication, that we anticipate conflicts that might come up, right? There might be disputes on the board side about how management's handling a particular issue. On the management side, we might have different expectations than the board about what we would hope their role to be and how involved we need them to be. And really thinking through those potential issues of conflict and bringing them to the forefront and having more open and robust conversations about potential areas of future conflict.
Thank you, Michelle. There's a big job that the general counsel has is the bridge, the early warning system, the making sure that communication is happening effectively. Kim, other thoughts additionally about the magical role of the general counsel being particularly well qualified in this regard in these times? What would you add?
Well, I want to build on what Michelle said, right? First and foremost, as lawyers, we are trained critical thinkers, and we are trained to deconstruct problems into their component parts and think very carefully about how to build strategies and analysis around that. I think in the boardroom, the unique thing that the GC, does is simplifies and translates that for the board and puts it into context for how it's going to manifest in the business or in the boardroom so that they know what it means to them, what it's going to look like, what they might experience and have to decide. That's really an important role. And my experience is, while the GC is not the only one that can do it, consistently my experience is that the GC is best at doing it. And it is, I think, a very unique value add. In addition to that, I would say most GCs that I know not only know the rules, right? We're talking about knowing the rules and deconstructing and translating them. The best GCs in the boardroom know the rules and they know the game. And when I say know the game, you know what the business is, you know what the trigger points are, you know what's material potentially and not material, and you're tuned into the risk appetite and tolerance of your board, your executive team, and potentially your shareholders. And so being able to connect the rules to winning the game and putting it in that context for everybody is super, I think, unique and value add in the boardroom.
I don't know how you all do it all, and thank you. I'm going to, Mary, come back to you for a thought, but Michelle, I'm going to go to you because you made some remarks during our planning call together. And in light of what Kim has just said, how in the heck do general counsels stay informed about the regulatory developments and what tools or networks or have really been most effective for you in sort of anticipating and managing all of this? And just, I want to note a question from related from Trish Wellenbach, where she is also asking you sort of practically, how do you keep the board advised? So anyone, Michelle, if you would.
Sure. I think there is that, obviously there is that concern, Trish, which is you don't want to sort of make mountains out of molehills. You really want to make sure that you have enough information to size that this is a risk of some significance and importance for the business, such that you would bring it to the board and say, here's an issue that we really see. So you want to be careful about that knowledge management and how you dispense that information to the board, usually sort of putting it in perspective with a big picture of, what's the revenue at risk? What's the business practice that would need to change, that would significantly, alter our risk profile? These are all things that kind of you want to consider and temper for each particular situation when thinking through, how much do you communicate with the board? That might be a deeply unsatisfying answer. If we have, if we want to talk through any specific examples, though, put them in the chat. We can definitely go through that. In terms of knowledge management, I think that, luckily general counsels are not operating on an island. If we're very lucky, we have incredible teams working with us to make sure that we're, doing the right amount of horizon scanning and understanding what are the issues that are top of mind. It's critical to maintain close ties to the general counsel community. There are some great networks that exist where people talk about trends in corporate governance, key enforcement issues. I personally have found, again, I sound like the evangelist for generative AI, but there's so many resources now where you can find generative AI news sources, where you get news top of mind. Originally when I was thinking through what are the risks of the existing administration, doing even a Gen AI review of tell me about Project 2025. What's been done, what hasn't been done, how would this impact a company in the consumer technology space? These are sort of just easy tools that you can deploy to continually stay on top of what's happening. You just have to sort of go through the work of refreshing. And in terms of older technology, there are things like news feeds where you should always have your company set for a news alert, because I find that most executives and board members do that. So you want to get the same news that they're getting about your company. But also for key notable laws like the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act that might impact your business significantly, or GDPR, you want to set those alerts as well to really make sure you're getting, the full funnel of tech information.
Thank you. There's been thus far a lot of discussion about the management of risk oversimplification. But Mary, you made a wonderful, I thought, observation during, again, our preparation for this conversation. And you said, yes, we need to manage risk, but what is the role of the general counsel also in surfacing opportunity? So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that, look, for most businesses, the biggest risk is that you're not successful in acquiring profitable customers and serving them well enough that they stick around. So I think that there is a really important shift to make. When I think about management board relations, what I think about is how do you set up a conversation where the board can really do what it does, which is, it operates at a little bit of a distance from the business. So it has a broader perspective. People can think differently about the way the world is changing around the company, but they don't have the deep expertise or the day-to-day knowledge of the management team. So if you think about, board reporting as a management up kind of thing, what you're losing is the best board reporting, I think, sets up a healthy conversation that empowers the board to know enough of what it needs to know to engage in the ways the board can be effective. When you do it poorly, it's too much information and too little sort of context. And I think risk is maybe one of the ways that happens worst. I think risk registers and all the formal ways we have of reporting risk, I get it. I think they can be really important. I think a well-designed risk function can help surface risks in a healthy way. But I think when I am on a board or when I'm serving a board, I think a much healthier or a much more effective way to think about it is, how do I help them understand the trade-offs that we need to make in order to move forward? All of those involve a mix of opportunity and risk, just by definition. And the more you can talk about that, like, this is what we're thinking, this is why we're inclined to go this way. If we believed X, we'd actually go a different way. Let's talk about X, rather than, here's why we're going to do it, here are the risks. And you sort of leave a really uncomfortable thing with the board, which is, now you've made me nervous about what we're doing, rather than empowered me to have a conversation with you about why we're doing it, why it makes sense, and what we all acknowledge could turn out badly. I think we tend to see good decisions as decisions that turn out well, and bad decisions as ones that turn out poorly. In fact, there's a lot of luck in whether things turn out well or poorly. And what you want to do with your board is have the kind of conversation where you make good decisions. And when from time to time they turn out poorly, because the world changes in ways you couldn't have known, that everybody's solid and you just sort of hunker down and yep, we absolutely, we decided to do all our manufacturing in China and we had really good reasons for that. And now what are we going to do about the tariffs? Like that you don't have people falling apart. How did this happen? So I think it's position the board to do its job well, tee up the right questions and tee them up in a way that is about business decisions and resilience, not revenue and risk management.
So in terms of business decisions, Kim, related to what Mary's been talking about, I'll just step back for a moment and say something I've observed from liaising with very large companies, be they directors on boards or general counsels, that there was a moment of, big word, paralysis almost. And then I had some dear friends who said, whatever you do something. And the point was made, and you had made this point previously, Kim, about sure risk. It's a little, my words, scary out there, a lot of uncertainty, but you still have to focus on growth and innovation. And so could you talk about that or anything else?
I think I'm stating the obvious when I say we're living through, at least in my lifetime, the most volatile and uncertain landscape. It's not that we haven't experienced some volatility or some uncertainty, but the degree, intensity, and speed of it today seems to pace anything I've ever seen and that a lot of people I know have seen. So in that context, as a GC, I think it's one of the qualities that we bring is the ability to stay calm, objective, and focused in moments of crisis, intensity, and complexity. But I think it's good to remember that sometimes it's the simplest things that can make a difference. And what I mean by that is reminding everybody of their role and the governance of the company, and that the standard isn't you can never make a mistake. That's not the standard. The standard is, are you well informed? Have you done your diligence? Have you made an informed, reasonable judgment based on using the resources at your disposal? Based on a reasonable reliance of what management is telling you. And you have to make a judgment one way or the other. It's okay if it turns out to be the wrong judgment. That will have consequences and no one wants it, but we needn't be afraid of making a mistake. The worst mistake we can make is to be paralyzed and not respond, is to be too locked in wanting more certainty or more information. So I think just sort of keeping everybody in that frame of mind about what does it mean to be reasonably informed and make reasonable judgments. Second, to do everything that you can to remind everybody of the resources that you can rely on and that are at your disposal. And then just talk about do we need advisors? Is there a resource we can bring? What is the level of understanding that the board needs to have, that the executive, those are different things, right? What is the right level of understanding and discipline? And are we meeting it? Okay. I mean, that's just a baseline for everything. And then finally, I think every GC that I have worked with or knows that it's sort of that adage, you can't make a friend when you need one. You need to make the friends and the network way ahead of the crisis. Same is true with your board, right? Amongst themselves and with you, you need to continuously establish a relationship of trust and mutual understanding, because it will help when you have to help people navigate anxiety-inducing and very upsetting and difficult situations. Having that relationship can make a big difference in keeping people kind of in the boat and not reacting and running in a different direction out of, human nature. Can't always prevent it, but it is good to sort of be investing in that daily.
We're going to come back to some of the subjects you touched on, Kim, and we're going to talk about whether we characterize this moment that we're in as crisis or something else. We are going to talk about strategies for managing crisis as we shift into the next part of our agenda. Before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge a question from Shepard Ferrara. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And each one of you, Michelle, Mary, and Kim, have all touched on AI in different ways. And if for those who aren't looking at the chat, she's talking about our uncertainty around data privacy and AI. What are you doing as general counsel, board, audit and risk committees, of course, to develop that appropriate risk appetite? I imagine you'll say one size fits one. In any event where there may be, as there is for all business, a risk around a data breach, etc. So, Michelle, you're an evangelist, no pressure, big, important topic. Would you like to share your thoughts?
Happy to. I think at minimum, at the foundation of this work is understanding how your data is being used, either the data of your users, your customers, your employees, as step one. And most folks have an understanding of this for privacy purposes, but for AI purposes, you really need to understand what data is being used, where it's going, and how folks that you work with are newly using data that you might have given them in the past. And so once you sort of do that exercise of mapping out, where the data is and where it's going, then you sort of move to the more interesting work, which is, what's our risk appetite? Where are we on the cutting edge, and are we going to try and, really stretch the boundaries of what's been done in the past? Like an OpenAI, or are we going to be much more conservative because that's not the type of business model that we engage in? And for something like that, it really helps to have conversations with, who are your product leaders, who are your eng leaders, who's your business strategy folks, where do you see the company going in the next 5 to 10 years? And do you have to make riskier decisions to get there, or do you not need to take on that risk to have that type of success of meeting your roadmap and planning? But then after sort of you've aligned the ducks on the management side, talking to the board and saying, here's the risk appetite that we have calibrated on our side, and sort of helping them understand how you got there and getting feedback on what they think that means from the sort of oversight and strategic perspective of what they perceive for where the company might go. So I think in the smallest nutshell, those would be the steps that I might take.
Thank you. Kim, Mary, anything you'd like to add on this subject?
I'd just quickly say, again, to echo Michelle, I think two things are true. I think you need to think about data use governance in your company. And that means, as Michelle said, it's the provenance of the data, the permissions around the data, the desired use for the data, and how I would call out your CISO, your CIO, if you happen to have a chief data officer, right? What is our level of discipline and sophistication? And it varies wildly around knowing those elements and then knowing how we want to use it, and then actually knowing whether that is or isn't what's happening. And that can be done at a spreadsheet level, or it could be done at a much more sophisticated level. And again, it varies across the board. I think the good news is this is becoming so critical. There's never been, I think, more tools available at any level, whether you're at a foundational level or at a much more sophisticated level. I think as GCs, it's helpful to educate yourself about what those tools are and how they might fit in the structure of your company, right? And its strategy. I think that is a good thing to know and understand.
Mary.
I'd add, so our data is the most sensitive data we have is client information. We don't have personal information from consumers. So I think the kind of data you have really informs the choice. But with the kind of data that we have, I really focus on trust. I think that the people we work with both desperately want us to use and help them find AI tools to navigate the world more cost effectively and effectively, and are terrified, right, about their information getting out and being used in a way that they didn't intend, they didn't control, and they don't like. And so there is a legal part of it, which is looking at our obligations to them and the terms and conditions of whatever AI platforms we might use. But I never think legal first. I always think trust first, because it's the only way you can navigate that tricky line and say, you know, would I be proud to have a conversation with assume the worst happens, and despite our best efforts, somebody suffers a data breach and we expose the data to that platform. Is it something that I believe I can sit down with somebody, explain what we were doing, why we were doing it, how we went about doing it, and we'll have a functional conversation? It may be an uncomfortable conversation, but it will be a functional conversation that will not destroy the relationship. That's when I can open my mind to that. It doesn't mean it's the only consideration. Again, there's a lot to do on InfoSec and legal terms and stuff. But that's where I can find a path forward, where I think like, wow, if they knew we did that, and I were in their shoes, I would never work with me again. Like, I would feel so betrayed and so violated and so unable to extend trust. That's where I don't care whether I can make an argument that legally it's okay or everyone's doing it. That's where like I wouldn't go in a million years. And I think having a grounding principle that cuts across the technical disciplines of InfoSec and data governance and legal into something that Michelle talked about it as risk tolerance, but you know, something that everybody can understand. And for me, trust is a word that like really everybody gets it. And it can lead to very functional conversations about, would we destroy trust if we did this and it didn't turn out well?
That's an incredible point, Mary. And I think we've seen some really great examples of this where, you know, companies unilaterally decided to change their terms of service, something they do all the time. And frankly, you know, most people often sit around wondering whether consumers actually read the terms of service updates. And, you know, people think, well, just, you know, just write in some text and see what happens. But, you know, for several companies who did that, then updated the terms to suddenly start using user data for purposes of training generative AI models, that broke trust for a lot of folks. They didn't feel like they saw it coming. They didn't think it was consistent with the use case of the platform. And I think that's a real question beyond, like you said, what's legal and what's not. It's a matter of, as a company, you need to protect and preserve user trust for the long term, because that's how a company really survives. You don't want to engage in anything that devalues the brand in that way, for sure.
Well, we've been talking about keeping companies safe and decision-making around that, and customers communicating with them in appropriate ways. And so most days things go well. And Kim, some days things don't go well. And you thought it was important that we talk to this group of colleagues about crisis management. And despite our best efforts, we need to talk about best practices in those moments. And I think if you're willing to share some examples of how you've navigated through those, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. I think it was Mary earlier, you know, or maybe it was Michelle. It was a great point. You know, we tend to view whether decisions are good or bad through the lens of how they turn out and retrospectively, which is unfortunate, but it's also human nature. You know, I want to go back to what I mentioned earlier, right? You need to be preparing for crisis as a matter of habit, as a matter of like routine. And what I mean by that is thinking through, you know, all of the elements that matter in a moment of great crisis. Do you have a protocol and a way to quickly pull the board together and get them up to speed? And to Michelle's point earlier, you know, can you be laying a foundation ahead of time of things that could happen and are risks and are not certainties, but sort of just, again, setting a landscape and saying, hey, we're doing the following things, but it's entirely possible that we could have this kind of crisis, this kind of issue. I'll use a really simple example from the last Trump administration, which was we realized very quickly that a PR response time and response time to potentially serious allegations or a tweet or something else had to be done in a matter of minutes, at most of an hour, right? It moved the entire time scale of how we thought about it. And so the chief marketing officer, the CFO, and I sat down and said, okay, let's pull together a protocol for responding, to these types of incidents within an hour. Let's tell everybody, this is our protocol. This is what to expect. And in these situations, we will never be able to go for perfection. We will never have all the information or everything we need within the hour. And we have to calibrate response time and action against what do we know and how certain are we of that knowledge? What can we say that is helpful quickly? And what should we avoid saying? And who are the people that quickly need to assemble and make those judgments and decisions? Who has the authority, the information, and the training to get it together and pull the trigger on those processes very, very quickly? And setting expectations, ahead of time. Most of the footfalls, for lack of a better term, that I have seen come from just not having a prepared response plan. You don't have to know exactly the issue or exactly the content, but some ability to respond quickly and at least get literate and make some decisions. Two, the other thing that I see that is very dangerous is people say things too soon that they don't really know are true for a fact. And they say things that get them in a lot of hot water because they turn out not to be true or not to be accurate, to be off base, and you lose trust and credibility immediately by saying something prematurely that is not helpful. So it's also oftentimes the case that you need to help people get comfortable with being less than perfect and being able to say, we don't have that answer. We will have that answer. We need to give you that answer, but we do not have it in this moment, as opposed to trying to go further to create a higher degree of comfort and confidence when you're just not ready. And so those are all things that I think are important, as are the relationships, because again, some things will go right, some things will go very wrong. And the ability to still remain a cohesive team with the executive team and the board in those moments matters a great deal to weathering them. It is when people fracture in those moments, whether on the executive team or at the board level, and I've seen this happen, when you fracture and have competing priorities or competing strategic points of view, and you can't bridge them somehow or ground them, it's really not good. That's also when you see a lot of paralysis or worse, factions and factionalism, which is just about the worst thing that I have seen happen at the board level. Almost no board can recover from that. Somebody ends up having to go, and the crisis always worsens before it gets better in those situations.
I'm having this dream, Kim, that we could somehow impart this really wonderful lessons you just shared to lots of people earlier in their career. Because so much of what all of you have shared today is really based on your extensive experience, which is also true of the people here. So it's just a good reminder to all of us to share those stories, because not everybody's going to be able to have that life experience, and we should do that to help prepare those who haven't actually been through the crisis, or Mary, one way in which we try to educate, if you will, prepare those who haven't lived it and lived through it, is the tabletop exercises. I think is probably mandatory for most of us in our respective roles. Sometimes you are the ones who are running them. Boards certainly do them. But Mary, what about the things that aren't contemplated through those tabletop exercises? What would you add to the wisdom of bank here?
So I think there are two common mistakes that people make, and tabletops can actually make you more likely to make them. I'm a big fan, but you're right, they're imperfect. They're necessary, but imperfect. One is there's a tendency to think in a crisis, I put my A team over there, and to forget that actually in almost all crises, you got to do two things. You got to fix the crises and you got to keep running the business. And so you need an A team in both places, and you need to balance sort of who's on each team so that each can be effective. If you take all your best players and put them on the crisis team, you just create a new crisis somewhere else. And that you've got to do that. There's a lot of studies of people are effective in decision making for about 6-8 hours, and maybe it's a little bit shorter in a crisis situation. And the tendency is to double down on the A team, and to double down on that A team is like, we'll stay here till it's done. And you are assured a bad outcome if you do that. So maybe you need 4 teams or 6 teams, because you got the running the business and the crisis team, and then you've got 3 shifts per day. So really thinking harder about assembling conceptual. Obviously each crisis would demand different skills, but conceptually thinking about your bench strength much more holistically than thinking, oh, okay, here's who we're going to throw at it. Because at a tabletop, you can ignore everything else that needs to continue being done. And by definition, they're time limited, so you don't have to worry about the 3-shift issue. The second thing, and it touches back on something Kim said, is I think that crisis communications is as important as crisis management. Crisis management is absolutely essential. Like, you cannot fix a crisis by talking your way through it. You've got to actually fix it. But I was at SVB a long time ago, and I continue to believe to this day, they ultimately failed not because of the balance sheet issues, which were real, but I believe they had fixed them, and where they messed up was communications. And they lost confidence. And for banks, there's, a number of hours between losing confidence and being dead. Like, banks are unbelievably fragile, and that was what tanked them. And so I think the tendency, and look, we do this as human beings. If somebody challenges me, my immediate go-to place, I think for most of us, is start defending myself. And that's what you have to avoid in a crisis. What you have to really get in your crisis communications is, I need to meet the people that I'm trying to talk to where they are. And I need to speak to them in ways that acknowledge the reality that they're experiencing and helps them understand. As Kim said, you have to be really careful not to tell them things that you don't really know whether they're true. You hope they're true, but you don't know. And you can't speak. So if I think about SVB, they explained why the problem was fixed, rather than thinking, every CFO is thinking, do I need to pull my deposits? And instead of sort of saying, here's why you, rational CFO or investor or CEO, can feel good about leaving your deposits, they talked about what they were doing and how it affected them. And I think that idea of, like, honest and deeply empathetic communications that meet your key constituents where they are and give them what they need to get through the crisis, rather than telling them what you want them to hear because you think it gets you off the hook. It's a basic mistake. So those would be the two things. Think about how many teams you really need to have, and think about what your communications are really trying to do. If you push a line onto people, rather than helping them feel okay, it's going to land flat, and it may worsen the crisis rather than improve it.
Can I add 2 quick points? Because I think what Mary said is so good. And my 2 quick points are just to illustrate just being very pragmatic about it. And I'm thinking about it in the context of hostile takeover attempts or proxy contests. And what I found in those situations is, it makes a difference to not just sort of describe a tactic or a strategy, but to be very specific with your directors and to say, make no mistake, you are going to be personally attacked in public and called incompetent. It is not true, but it is what they are going to do. And when it happens, you will want to fight and defend yourself with everything you have. And you are going to have to resist the urge to be baited into doing what they want you to do. And I literally found myself saying that every 48 hours, because imagine, Mary, I think, said it, when you are personally attacked or someone challenges you directly, your instinct, your natural instinct is very hard to manage and suppress. But if you kind of flash the warning lights and pull the alarm and say, this train is coming, here it comes, there's the bell, here it comes, over and over, at least you're helping people react and respond a bit differently and in a more managed way. My other point is, and this is a big one, and it's really hard. I don't know anybody who's fully mastered it, but the worst thing that you can do is underreact, right? And here's what I mean by that. Just before the pandemic, there was a lot of information floating around saying, you know, this is happening. There's a potential for this. We're not, you know, here, we're hearing this, we're hearing that. Companies who looked at that and immediately said, there is going to be, let's just accept there's going to be a worldwide global pandemic. What does that mean? Let's start preparing now, versus the ones who waited, you know, for the lockdown and everything else. Even a few weeks of time can make a big difference, right? I once spoke to the Secretary of the Interior about one of the massive oil spills that happened. And in the first hours, it wasn't clear how big the oil spill was. And he said, my first reaction was, this is going to be a disaster of catastrophic proportions, and I must get on the phone with the president right now. He did not wait, right? So could you be accused of overreacting in the event that it's not as bad as you think it could be right out of the gate? Possibly. But I will take the overreaction over the underreaction in terms of effectiveness every time.
Well, Kim, you know how in those game shows, there's like a one lifeline call that you can make? I've decided that it's going to be you. Should I find myself in one of those situations, or I imagine a lot of people are feeling that way. There's also, there was another subject that I was hoping that we would get to today, because but I'm glad that we spent the time we did, and we could have spent a lot more time on crisis management. And I wanted to talk about what I'm going to characterize from my perspective, the evolving and increasing number of special committees that I see stood up and stood down. They're sometimes and often just for a discrete purpose, of course. So I'll just say, perhaps for a future program, and you know, very interested in our members and participants, if that subject matter around special committees, when and why, etc., would be of interest. And I would rather have further gems from the three of you, because we are coming to our close. We have 5 minutes left. So I am going to ask each one of you to share something either you'd like people to send them away with, or one of the favorite offerings we have in these programs is for you to share a question that you think a general counsel should be asking in the boardroom, or also for a director. What is a good, fully engaged, well-prepared director? What question should she be asking these days? And Michelle, you've been good in the pressure situation, so I'm going with you first.
It's going to be not a surprise. It's going to be, what's your plan on AI? Do you have governance principles? Do you know where your data sits? Do you know how it's being used? Are you, how are you using your customer data, and are you doing it in a way that, continues to build trust and is fully transparent? I think a solid director at consumer technology company really needs to get the answer to that question.
Yeah, and fair to say, Michelle, revisit it. That's not a one-time question that should
That's
be
right.
asked. It should be regularly revisited.
That's
Mary?
right. And it shouldn't just be the principles.
sorry.
It should be, what are you doing on the product side on AI as well? How are you getting ahead? It's not just managing, it's also
Right.
pushing forward. This should be propelling your business, and how are you
The
doing that?
innovation and growth side.
Yep.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
So my
Mary?
it's counterintuitive, and you're constantly challenged to do exact opposite, but learn to slow way down. I think right now, whether it's AI or global trade or whatever, the most important thing is to become more conscious of the belief systems and the assumptions that are causing us to reach decisions that actually don't make sense in these times. As Kim said, it is the speed and magnitude of change that is happening today is unprecedented. And I think when you are moving fast and the adrenaline's running and I'm like super smart, I'm on it, I'm going, the risk you run is you assume the tariffs are going to stay the same next week, that there will be an election in 2 years, that whatever, like, we're at a time of check your premises really carefully, because you will make mistakes that you will regret if you move too fast. And don't get yourself, your board, your management team to slow down and say, what if our premises aren't right? Do we still stand by the same decision? And it can be really hard to do when there's so many demands to like do this fast. So whatever it is for you, find the way that you like take a giant deep breath and go do something, and think deeply every day about all the things that really matter, and then move faster.
So I'm gonna go, those were such great specific examples. I'm gonna go slightly macro, which is to say, both for GCs and board members, I think the question you should be asking yourself is, do I feel like I have a fulsome enough understanding of what the material issues to my business are? And what I mean by that is, how important is our data, how material is our data strategy, which will dictate how muscular should our information and focus on it be. If you're a consolidator or you need M&A for growth, what's my antitrust strategy? How difficult will it be to accomplish these things? If I'm in a financially vulnerable position or have a lot of cash on the balance sheet, how susceptible am I to an activist? How attractive am I? Am I well protected enough? Or if it's a competitive threat, do you understand the fundamentals of the competitive threat? You can't pay attention to everything, but at least focusing on what are the most material issues to the business and making sure that you are investing time, focus, and energy to make sure your board is literate, that you understand enough about it to be able to respond or to help strategically if there are shifts, I think is really foundational. And hard, because there's so much going on every day, to say, I'm going to invest a disproportionate amount of my time and the board's time in the boardroom on a couple of issues, because they're the most important ones, is hard to distill and do. But I think it is helpful, because there a lot of bad things are going to happen. Some are going to matter a lot more than others. And you just need to try and develop the discernment to know which ones are going to really matter and which ones will be merely unpleasant.
Well, today, your recent comments and the entire session, I believe I speak on behalf of the audience here. This has been a gift. We appreciate to the panel your time and sharing your extensive experience. And to me, on a personal level, grateful for your friendship and mentorship. I would like to acknowledge that we did not get to all the questions in the chat. And there's some really good one. Thank you, Dan Hauser, for raising some cool, fun topics, and a really incredibly important one that's on my mind, literally almost every hour of every day, raised by Robin Gonzalez. And I wanted to apologize that we didn't get to that. And I hope the community is discussing that, those subject matters. So I will send you off with a friendly reminder to connect with us, the four of us here, with the leadership of NACD, with each other. Send me your bio if you're ready to serve on a board. Let me see if I can be of a support to you in connecting dots. And lastly, to everyone, please save the date for our first in-person General Counsel cohort meeting on November 6th from 3 to 6, co-hosting with PwC. It will be at their offices. And you will receive a save the date from NACD within the next few business days. My thanks to you all, again to the panel, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.